Good morning, Binkley. I am an interloper. I'm Steve Coggins. I am the most underqualified chauffeur that has ever lived. It has been my pleasure to drive my good friend Jim Wallis primarily over eastern North Carolina, and we are so delighted to end this book tour here at Binkley, which is a spiritual home for many, I think beyond maybe even what you can envision. In many ways, a spiritual home for my wife Louise and I, who we live in Wilmington now. We went to school here at Chapel Hill. I believe you're here because you know who Jim Wallis is, a national figure that in many ways needs no introduction, a modern day prophet. As you know, being a prophet is not a fun thing to do, and especially now. And he's going to be talking to you guys this morning about some tough things. I will tell you, and I will share with you about how I became a good friend with Jim. My wife Louise and I were at a Renaissance weekend. And Renaissance is set up a lot like, do you remember what it was like during orientation week when you went to undergraduate school? You had so many things to choose from, so many talks that were going on simultaneously. And I was just going by, sticking my head in, seeing what was interesting. And I walked in, and this guy was behind this podium, and he said, the answer is neither to the right nor to the left, but deeper. And I was hooked right from the beginning with this guy named Jim Wallis, who hails originally from Detroit, went to Michigan State. The Spartans had a good day yesterday. And he can tell you a little bit about his theological seminary experience. But right out of seminary, he formed Sojourners, which became a magazine that is a bastion of Christian thought today, but began much like a church in the days of the early church, like reading the second chapter of Acts and whatnot. And it was involved in worship and in service in the community and whatnot. And of course, Jim has written many books, and his latest one, The False White Gospel, that he's talking about. But this is, you'll pick up really quickly that this is not a book tour. This is something much bigger than that. And I am pleased to turn over to you, Jim Wallis.
Good morning.
Good morning.
So, to be honest, sometimes when I preach in a church, I don't know much about that church before I get there. But this is an exception, because I know about your church, Binkley. I know about your church and your history. And one of your members, a long time ago, used to, and I'll say this in the service, order 12 copies of whatever book I had just written. And when I saw who it was, Dean Smith, I said, wow, the basketball team's reading my books. And no, it was his Sunday school class right here at Binkley. So Dr. Linnea is here. I'm so blessed to see her and your daughter. So I'd like to have a conversation. I'm going to preach in a few minutes, but more a conversation here with you. I always get some people have told me that some of the people here have read the book, and there they are, and they're bringing their books to sign. That always makes me a little nervous because I got to be on my toes if people have read the book. Every author gets these letters. We read your book, and could you come and talk to us about it? Every author. There's authors here, I'm sure, in the room who know that. But I got a letter like that for one of my previous books a long time ago called The Soul of Politics. And I saw the letter was from inmates at Sing Sing Prison in upstate New York. With the New York Theological Seminary had a program teaching Masters of Divinity inside the walls of Sing Sing. So I thought this should be interesting. So I wrote back and said, to the young brother who wrote me, "When do you want me to come?" He said, "Well, we're free most nights." Kind of a captive audience here, he said. And so I went and I had this rigorous conversation. Now in chapter 6, you say this. Unpack that, you know. So I'm always on my toes when some people have read this book. So I've had a tour. I'll come to North Carolina a lot in the Triangle, you know, and I actually have sat down with North Carolina and Duke people breaking bread and trying to build bridges, you know. So peacemaking, you know, is one of my chapters in the book. But when I saw Phil Ford this morning, I'm like a kid, a sports fan. It's like, am I really meeting Phil Ford? Oh my goodness. One of my heroes, a Hall of Fame basketball player. And we got to talk a little bit about what he's doing now, and I'm not surprised. But let me go to that. You're from Rocky Mount, right? And so is Roy Cooper, I learned the other day over breakfast. And we went there. One of our stops was there at Truth Tabernacle. And Bishop Haywood there was one of my best contacts on this trip. And we crossed those tracks a dozen times throughout that day. Railroad tracks. Right down the middle, with two counties, one on one side, one on the other. Two worlds, one black, one white, on one side or the other. Now, a lot of folks have told me we don't have tracks, but we have neighborhoods, and I think they're like tracks that divide us, one side and the other. Those railroad tracks are on the election ballot this time. And if we don't see that, we're not seeing what's at stake in this election. And it won't be resolved by an election, it'll go on afterwards too. But there are a lot of people in this country who are pursuing a strategy that could be summed up in one sentence. They want to prevent our changing demography from changing our democracy. Let me say it again. They want to prevent our changing demography from changing our democracy. The elephant in the room is what that is in every policy decision in Washington, D.C. Because they can't fully change our demography. That's just changing. But they can do gerrymandering. They can do voter suppression. They can do voter corruption. They can do all kinds of things on voter restrictions. And the Republican legislature from here put this bill forward on voter restrictions, and your North Carolina Supreme Court named that as surgically targeting black voters. That isn't me, that isn't Reverend Barber, that's the North Carolina Supreme Court. Surgically targeting black voters. So, a lot of things on this election on the ballot, but white Christian nationalism is on the ballot in this election. That's not a new kind of religion. It goes way back to before our founding as a nation. It was a doctrine of discovery that papal bulls supported, and it gave white Europeans the idea that this new land belonged to them. So they were able to displace almost destroy an indigenous population, and then to enslave a whole African population with a racial hierarchy. Our slavery was unique here in this country and in Britain because it had a lot. Slavery wasn't new. You lost a war, you were in slavery. This one had a racial hierarchy that you're never allowed to get out of, about who was superior and who was inferior. That racial hierarchy continues to this day. Brian Stevenson says slavery never ended, it just evolved. Now with mass incarceration. I can talk about policing, so many things. But that's on the ballot. This old theology is making a comeback in support of Donald Trump. So to me, this is, as you said, don't go left, don't go right, go deeper. So I want to know, I'd love to just talk to you and help me understand North Carolina and what's going on. On the side of the tracks of Truth Tabernacle that I was there, a lot of black clergy came. And they just wonder, why isn't religion, why isn't faith on the ballot, on the other side of the tracks? What about the gospel? This book has got 6 iconic biblical passages, and I'll do 1 or 2 of them in the sermon. Only have 20 minutes. Now in a black church, I have a lot longer. Episcopal church, I have 10 minutes. This is a progressive church, you get 20, right? So I'd rather have a conversation among a lot of you, but this is, where is faith in all this? Not just in 60 days, but beyond. Where's faith? Where's the gospel? Is it even a part of the conversation? Why is it not a part of the conversation? So I'll give you one text, and that's it, and then we're going to open it up. You're going to be surrounded with a lot of political noise. We all will be in the next 60 days. Pundits, polling, attacks, all that. Noise, noise, noise. And when I just feel all that noise, one text I go to is first chapter, first book of the Bible, Genesis 1:26. And when, with a noise in my head, I go to that text, and it says, I love this, with a noise around me, then God said, be quiet, noise. Shut up, noise. Then God said, and then it reads, let us make humankind in our image and after our own likeness. Humankind is all of us. First chapter, first book of the Bible, the divine foundation for all our earthly talk about human rights, civil rights, voting rights. So I'm involved with people in North Carolina we're training poll chaplains to be at perilous polling places in North Carolina, where voter suppression and intimidation is being threatened. And I say in those calls, I did one yesterday for Detroit, and the Secretary of State was on the call, Jocelyn Benson in Michigan, my home state. And I said, any attempt to suppress, deny, not count, subvert a vote because of the color of somebody's skin or any other reason is an assault on Imago Dei, Latin for the image of God. An assault on Imago Dei. This is theological, not just partisan or political, it's theological. The image of God is at stake in this election. So on the call, I said, we are the Imago Dei movement. the Imago Dei movement, trying to protect the image of God in this election with those who would assault it. So, I know that's heavy stuff, but that's where we're at. So I'd love to hear, I'll preach in the service, but I'd love to hear from you all. Binkley, I think, has a different history than lots of churches in North Carolina. So I'd like to hear from you all about how you see faith at stake. I think the faith factor in this election could be decisive, one way or the other. And it really is Christian nationalism versus Jesus. Christian nationalism versus Jesus. I was talking to black and white pastors. How do we get people talking about Jesus before this election and afterwards? How do we get people talking about Jesus? Now, Binkley, your pastor's away. Marcus, I miss meeting him, but I'll meet him again. How do we talk about Jesus? How do you talk about Jesus with your friends and family, with other congregations in the next 60 days and afterwards? So, turning the question to you. Rather than you can ask me questions too, but how do we do that? How do we get churches in a conversation, or even let's call it a debate, about the teachings of Jesus? Now, Jesus is not a partisan Republican Democrat, of course not, but there's values that should shape our voting. How do we get the teaching of Jesus being talked about in this critical moment? So over to you. Yep.
Well, this is the home state for Billy Graham, frankly.
Yeah, it is. Therefore,
We have a more prevailing perspective on what Christianity means in this state than the kind of Christianity we generally discuss in this church, and in Wallis, and in the other churches. And ours is not the prevailing voice, but it is a discussion, and I've been heartened by the fact that in the paper, which I still take, that there are ministers speaking up in this election and have appeared on the editorial pages of the Charlotte Observer and the Charlotte News. So some are trying, and I would suspect they are the minor voice in their communities.
Billy Graham was a friend. We had lots of conversations over the years. At his initiative, we became friends. But sometimes the apple falls far from the tree. So I wasn't invited to his funeral service by Franklin. I saw an ad the other day from Billy Graham Crusade about preaching how we all need God's forgiveness. We've all sinned. We need to ask God for forgiveness. All of us can ask for forgiveness, no matter what our sins. Then it flashed to an interview that Donald Trump had a while back, where he was asked if he'd ever asked the forgiveness of God. And the candidate for President of the United States said, I really have never felt the need for that. It just juxtaposed Billy Graham and Donald Trump. Franklin was very angry that his father's image was used, but Billy said that, and Trump said that. So these are, and yet a whole lot of white evangelicals, my background, don't seem to care about that. That's a faith issue for me, not just a political one. So those two, Billy and Franklin, and Billy met Dot King, and it was, I think Hilton got the two couples together once for a weekend at one of the Hilton hotels. So they had a relationship. So that's a good North Carolina question. So where are we in North Carolina? What's going on? Particularly in white churches. What's going on? Tell me. Or ask a question. That'd be fine too. Binkley has not been a shy church over the years. So don't be shy. Please.
Binkley is not where I would start with the voter registration drive. Because it's like preaching to the choir here. And in some ways...
But the choir is going to have to practice in a few minutes, so if some of you slip out, I won't take it personally. I just met the music director in the hallway.
She's watching. Anyway, we can start here, but I feel like with voter registration, and my point of view has always been reproductive freedom. And that's very much on the ballot and very much in the forefront of people's minds. But my point of view has been, we don't need to do a voter registration here. We don't even need one in front of the library, because people, in this area are pretty tuned in. We need it in other counties. We need it in other outlying areas around here. We need to take it to UNC, where kids need to change their address to vote here and not back home. We might need to talk about it in our own families. And I'm going to a wedding soon, where I have to decide soft pedal it or become strident. And I'm trying in my own mind to work out a middle ground.
Brittany Packnett, who is one of the national leaders of Black Lives Matter, I met her in the streets of Ferguson after the shooting of Michael Brown. And she came to Georgetown recently and talked to my class. And she said, so white people who want to join us in Black Lives Matter demonstrations and risk rubber bullets and tear gas and all that, that's fine, you're welcome. If you survive, you'll say, I was there and I made it. The bigger risk for you all white people is to talk to your family and friends. That's a bigger risk. And I think talking to family and friends is critical now in congregations. Congregations, family, friends is critical now. And it's got to be not just, we can have debates over abortion or other issues, all that's well and good. But I want to talk about faith. What's at stake for those of us who say Jesus is at our core? How is Jesus at our core? How does that shape our participation in our society and even our voting? You can't vote for Jesus, but how do we have that conversation in North Carolina, in congregations, in family dinner tables, where we're trying to figure out that? I tell my students, at Georgetown, I have my students, there's always a discussion before they go home for Thanksgiving dinner about how to handle the dinner, And I tell them, don't just point fingers and say, you're wrong and I'm right. Thanks for paying for my college, but you're wrong and I'm right. Talk about yourself and how you're changing, what you're going through. Most parents care about what their kids are going through. Talk about yourself and how you feel about your faith, or how you feel about what's going on, what your moral conscience is telling you. I would love to see those conversations all over the country before this election. Please.
I would just add to that, thank you, and I think we need to have those conversations in black families as well.
Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am. Please. What's that like?
Oh, you would be surprised. But before I go to that point, let me just say that we've got to recognize that change never really flows from silence is golden. So
What?
silence is golden, never really
Yes,
changes.
yes.
So we've got to get to a point where we're willing to not just talk to our families, but speak up and be radical in our own churches. You're never going to talk and encourage other people if they're not hearing your voice, because you believe and it's good in your heart, but you're being silent. And so whatever ministers are saying in churches and whatever other members of your congregation are saying, and you're sitting at the luncheons or Sunday school or whatever, and you're just listening, and in your heart you know it's not right, but you're not speaking out, you've got to be willing to be the radical in the pew, even in the church.
What's your name?
I'm Cassie. I'm a member of Binkley, so.
Okay. What Kathy said is, so silence isn't golden. That's a great way to put it. And where are we having those conversations? And how much are we, and also in public forums, school board meetings, public candidate forums, where people are talking about the issues. Are we speaking up and speaking out? Would people even know we're Christians by how we speak and what we raise, you know? So I think you're exactly right. And, you know, I just think those conversations, if we remain silent, having our own view and others having their own view, but remain silent in the next 60 days and beyond, we're in serious trouble. And you're right, those conversations have to happen in black churches too. A lot of black ministers tell me that they need to have their own conversations in their churches too, and in our communities. The conversation, or I would say again, the debate about faith needs to happen because so much is at stake. I did a podcast with James Clyburn the other day. It'll be out next week. He's a leader in Congress for sure. He's also a historian, and he was explaining how the end of Reconstruction in the South, where in North Carolina and all over the South, former slaves were not just voting, but running for office and winning elections. Members of Congress, governors, in the Senate, all over the South. And a deal was made between the two white parties to allow Rutherford Hayes to become the president if he took the troops out of the South. And Jim told me it was one vote that decided that. And that was the beginning of Jim Crow. One vote. So these are close political elections, and they have devastating, the end of Reconstruction. It ended because it was working. It was bringing former slaves into voting and government. It was working, and that's why they ended it. And the same slaveholder religion took power again. And so let's have the conversation. And North Carolina, I'll say this in this service, North Carolina, the media tells me all the time, is in play. Is faith in play too? How do we do that? Please, yes, sir. Tell us your name.
Tim Bradshaw.
Hey, Tim.
The media and everyone has pointed out the division in our nation, in that everybody is polarized to one side or the other, and that I think occurred in the early 90s and the early parts of this last 2 decades too, even within the church. And I think one of the big losses I have sensed in my soul is the loss of within the Baptist denomination, we want to call it that, that freedom of the soul, and the freedom within the Baptist denomination, particularly. I don't know if you can speak on any of that or not.
Yeah, I used to do a lot of speaking at Southern Baptist seminaries all over the country, Southern Baptist seminaries. Not anymore. There was a coup, basically, almost a... What's that? I preached at Southern before. The Clarence Jordan lectures at Southern Seminary. Clarence Jordan was from Southern, and he went and started Koinonia Farms in Georgia. In the 50s, a multiracial community in the 50s in Georgia, Americus, Georgia, from Southern. And Gordon Cosby, who also was with Clarence, he went to Washington, D.C. to start Church of the Savior. And he was my spiritual director for many years. But now, Glenn Stassen was there at Southern, who invited me to come, and he got purged out. So they purged out, and it was a political purge. And so, and you all were victims of some of that too here. So, yeah, these are political purges going on. And the takeover of evangelicals wasn't a theological shift. It was started by political operatives. One of them was named Richard Viguerie. He was the direct mail guru of the country at that time, just before 1980. And Richard and I know each other, and he brags to me how he went to Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson and said, "Give me your lists, and I'll make you household words in America. I'll make your names household words in America." And he got the list, and that's how we got the moral majority. That's literally how it came to be. It wasn't a religious movement, it was a political one. But then religions followed suit and did their own coups, really. It's happening in the Reformed Church in America right now, where friends of mine who teach at Calvin College are probably going to lose their jobs because of how they've made the sexuality issues covenantal in their whole formation, and those who have different views are being moved out. So we're facing political coups inside and outside of religion. But we've stood up to this before. In fact, when I was coming back from the bathroom just now, I saw this poster on the wall of Nelson Mandela. I got to meet Nelson Mandela when he came out of prison. He had gatherings with faith leaders. And here's what the poster in your hallway says: "There is no easy walk to freedom anywhere. There is no easy walk to freedom anywhere. And many of us have to pass through the valley of the shadow of death before reaching the mountains of our desires." That's from Psalm 23, my favorite psalm, which I usually repeat sometime during the day. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures and leads me beside still waters. He restoreth my soul." Then it says, "He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake." Now, the word righteousness in the Hebrew scriptures is synonymous with the word justice. Righteousness and justice mean the same thing. So he leads me in the paths of righteousness and justice for his name's sake. Then it gets to this. And yea, though I walk through the valleys of the shadow of death. Why are you walking through the valleys of the shadow of death? Because we're being led in the paths of justice for his name's sake, which puts you in sometimes the valley of the shadow of death. That's what Nelson Mandela figured out. It's right there in Psalm 23. But it says, I will fear no evil. Political coups of churches are evil. For thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table in the presence of my enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil, my cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. So we face a whole lot of stuff. We face political coups. We face, in Alabama, they were purging a whole lot of voters. Turns out it's all black voters. And some of them were purged because they never voted. They hadn't voted in the last election, and they got purged. Some of the ones that were purged were young, new black voters who weren't old enough to vote in the last election, and so they didn't. And they got purged as young black voters because they didn't vote in the last election. Was that accidental? No. So we're walking through a lot of stuff. And I think it feels sometimes like the valley of the shadow of death. But I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. I see a smile on Phil Ford's face. Phil, what do you think of all this? Can I call you out for a question or a comment?
Sure. Well, my sister and I, this is my sister, were attending a church, I won't name the church, and we stepped away from that church because it became really, really far right. And she was on this email list that she would get things to pray for that we just didn't believe in. And I think, to me, we've lost Jesus Christ is love. And I think we're losing that sight. I think we're getting into the condemning. Now, I do think God condemns too. I do think there's a heaven, I believe there's a hell. And I think hell is just not being the absence of Jesus Christ in your life. But I think we need to focus more on loving our neighbor and getting along than the differences that we have. And I know, like, this church indirectly has meant so much to me in my life, because with Coach Smith, when I was at Carolina, I've always been a Christian, but I hadn't always been religious. In North Carolina, if you were a freshman, all freshmen had to attend church on Sunday. And I had a roommate, a guy named Tom Zalagaris from Detroit, Michigan. We had to fill out these forms every Sunday night. Test you had, did you meet any tutors, did you go to church? Now, when I would wake up to go to church, Zal would be laying in the bed. And, you know, I'd get ready, you know, Southern Baptist, coat and tie, go to church. I get back, Zal is laying in the bed. So he would check, yes, he went to church. And this happened like 3 or 4 Sundays in a row. So I finally said, are you going to church? Or, you know, we're roommates, you know, what's going on? He says, yeah, I go to the Newman Center right across the street, Catholic. I get up, throw on some jeans, no socks, no shoes, wash my face. We're in there 30 minutes and I'm out. For the rest of that semester, I was Catholic. I went. But Coach Smith planted the spirituality in my life. Even when I was a player at Carolina, he would have these pamphlets in my locker after practice, and I'd look at it and look over it. When I was on the staff, I'd get back from lunch, there'd be a book on Christianity on my desk, and I really didn't pay a whole lot of attention to it, but the last 10, 11 years of my life, I've been extremely spiritual, and, you know, devotions and men's meeting and church every Sunday, and I do believe, like you're saying, there is a big gap in what we believe. And as you said, it's just two different gods, two different Jesus Christs. And I think one is love and one is condemnation, and thinking that one group is taken away from the other group.
So love your neighbor as yourself needs to be on our ballot this fall. And what I'm going to preach on in your service in a few minutes here is that very text. And the question, who is my neighbor, is the biggest question for democracy. Who is my neighbor? And that's the text for the sermon. I see my friend waving her hand. It's time to quit. You got a quick last word here? Quick last word? And then I've got to go and sign some books if you want.
Sure. My name is Dave Williams, and I just wonder, it's not a last word or question, you can answer it quickly, hopefully. I see a lot of movement, which I love, to reclaim the flag and some of the language of American pride. And I wonder are you seeing something similar? I think modern progressive churches could reclaim the language of God and the Jesus language that I think we moved away from, but I think it's being misused in the public sphere. So anyway, I'd love your.
Well, I was watching the Democratic Convention and saw the reclaiming of the flag, and my first thought was your question. What would it mean for Christians to reclaim Jesus, to reclaim our faith in this whole conversation publicly? Now, respecting pluralism and many traditions and people of no faith at all, we're all equal in this country, absolutely. But the separation of church and state, which I believe in, does not mean the segregation of moral values from public life. So how do we reclaim our faith respectfully in a pluralistic environment and not be afraid of that? I think that could change the whole conversation. This is a group I keep talking to for a couple hours, and then we'd miss the service, and Marcus would not be happy with that, even though he's away. But I feel blessed to be with you. I feel blessed to be in this church. I really do. So thank you so much for coming this morning.